Hello, my name is Kurt Guidry. I'm an extension economist with the LSU AgCenter with major responsibilities in feed grain and soybean economics. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about soybean economics, particularly as it relates to soybean production here in the state of Louisiana. Just kind of a presentation outline. What we're going to do is talk about some basic trends in domestic soybean production, both here in the U.S. as well as here in Louisiana, and talk about some of the things that we've seen in terms of supplies of soybeans over the last several years. We're going to then talk about soybean use and supply and demand dynamics and that interaction between supply and demand and the determination of prices, soybean prices, looking at projections for prices and how do we make those projections. And then finally going to end up with an examination of the soybean cost of production for Louisiana soybean production. Going over some of the details in terms of what those costs of production are, how they've changed over the years, and where they may go in the future. I'll start off by talking about soybean production. Soybean production historically represents about 20 to 25% of all the row crop acreage in the United States. It's really only second to corn in terms of the number of acres planted on any given year. Similarly, when you look at Louisiana, soybeans historically are our #1 crop in terms of acreage each year. And the primary reason for that we see this large acreage of soybeans in Louisiana is that for the most part soybeans can be grown in just about any area of the state. The variability, the flexibility in terms of soybean production really makes it one that allows a lot of our producers here in the state to produce and produce successfully. This graph shows U.S. soybean acreage from 1980 to 2013. And as you can see here, particularly from the early 1990s, we've had a relatively sharp upward trend in terms of soybean acreage. We did have that dip in 2004, 2005, but you can see since then that we've seen a pretty big resurrection in terms of soybean acreage here in the United States. That's been primarily a function of the renewable fuel standards. Biofuel production here in the United States really created some demand base for both feed grains and soybeans as we moved into the latter half of the 2000s. And that created some price incentives for producers to move production out of some of the other commodities that have traditionally been grown and into feed grains and soybean production. Over the last several years, we've been somewhere in the neighborhood of about 70 to 78 million acres of soybeans produced in the United States each and every year. And in 2013, we were at about 77 million acres planted in the United States in 2013. This next table just basically shows the top 10 producing states in terms of acreage across the United States. And you can see there most of those are in the Midwestern states. What we would term as the Corn Belt states. Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, Indiana, Missouri have historically been in the top 5 or 6 states in terms of acreage. When you look at those top 10 states, they represent about 77% of the total soybean acreage in the United States and about 80% of the total production in the United States over the last 10 to 11 years. Louisiana, how does Louisiana rank in there? Louisiana ranks about 18th over the same time period, representing about 1 to 2% of total planted acreage from Louisiana. And again, we wanted to point out these top 10 states because when you look at where our soybean market moves from year to year, a lot of it's going to be driven upon what happens to the soybean crop, not so much here in Louisiana since we do make such a small percentage of the total U.S. production, but what happens to the domestic soybean crop in these big top 10 states. Looking at U.S. soybean yields, again you see there that we've had an upward trending pattern in terms of soybean yields over the last 20 or so years. The dotted line the red dotted line is the average soybean yield from 1980 to 1989, which was about 30 bushels an acre. And you can see here over the last 20 years or so, we've seen pretty dramatic increases in yield capability in our U.S. soybean crop. When you look at starting off in the 1980s of about a 30 bushel an acre yield, average yield. In 2010, 2013, that was up above 40 bushels, around 42 bushels an acre. So we've seen about a 12 bushel an acre increase in about a 20 to 30 year period, which is a pretty substantial increase. And again, when you look at 2010, 2013 average at about 42, we also have to take in consideration that that's a little bit deceiving because we had such a severe drought in 2012 in the Midwest. That's probably a little bit artificially low. But overall, we've seen tremendous increases in terms of soybean yields over the last several years. Newer varieties, new technology, all driving the production capability of our soybean acreage here in the United States. Taking a look at Louisiana soybean acres, a little bit different picture than what we saw in the U.S. Back in the 1980s, we were around 3 million acres of soybeans planted in Louisiana. We saw a pretty substantial decline in acreage all the way really into the early 2000s. And predominantly that was a shift out of soybean production into some of our other competing crops, cotton, rice, sugarcane. Again, during that time frame, we looked at soybean prices that were really not nearly as competitive to other competing crops as they are today. And as farmers should, they reacted to those price signals and reduced acreage. Again, about in mid-2000s, 2004, 2005, we saw a resurgence of soybean acres. Again, that was a function of primarily increased soybean demand worldwide, and particularly when you look at the renewable fuel standard set by the U.S. policy to mandate a certain amount of biofuel production in the United States. And we saw the reaction to prices for both feed grains and soybeans. And again, producers reacted and increased the plantings of those two commodities. Where we're at right now is just a little over 1 million acres. Over the last 5 or 6 years, we have averaged between 900. We have been somewhere between 900,000 to 1.2 million acres of soybeans in Louisiana. Again, that is the largest number of acreage planted of any crop that we grow here in Louisiana. But when you look at it on a global perspective, we only represent about 1.5% of total U.S. soybean acres. Again, back in the 80s when we were producing or planting about 3 million acres, we were up somewhere around 4 to 5% of total U.S. acres. Now that we've leveled out somewhere in the 900,000 to 1.2 million acres, we've been somewhere in that 1 to 1.5% of total planted acres. Where are soybeans grown in Louisiana? Well, in a lot of different areas. In 2012, 45 of our 64 parishes reported soybean production. The largest ones, however, are these top 10s that we have listed here in terms of acreage. St. Landry, East Carroll, Madison, Morehouse. And when you look down the list, primarily what we're looking at is the majority of our soybean production being in the central and the northeast part of our state. You look at those top 10, they represent about 65% of total planted acres and about 70% of total production. But we've seen an expansion of soybean acres not only to these traditional growing areas, but into some non-traditional growing areas, particularly over the last several years, as soybean prices have reached historical highs and really created some incentives for producers that have not historically grown soybeans to get into soybean production. And again, we look at primarily looking at the sugarcane growing area and some additional areas in southwest Louisiana where soybean production has been a little bit more variable. Over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen a steady increase in the number of acres that we've had in the traditional sugarcane growing areas and in some of our southwest traditional rice growing areas as soybean prices have improved and made it much more profitable for those producers to get into soybean production. When you look at the trend situation that we have in soybean yields, again, it's very similar to what we saw in the U.S. trend. We're looking at a steadily increasing trend in terms of soybean yields here in Louisiana. As we did in the U.S. picture, we looked at kind of a 10-year breakdown of yields. So in 1980s, to 1989, where we're looking at soybean yield somewhere, an average soybean yield in the U.S., in Louisiana, of somewhere around 23 to 24 bushels an acre. We fast forward to 2010, 2013, and we see that our average soybean yield during that time frame is somewhere around 42 to 43 bushels an acre. So we've seen a 20 bushel increase in that 1980 to 2013 time frame. That's again been primarily a function of improved varieties for the southern growing region of the United States. It's also been a function, I think, to some part, of producers realizing that soybeans can be very, very profitable and increasing the amount of management and the amount of attention they've given to soybean production, particularly over the last 10 years or so. So as varieties have improved, as producers have increased management and improved their management of soybean production in here in Louisiana, we've seen a pretty substantial increase in terms of our yields. When you look at this next slide, something that we would have never have guessed 10 to 15 years ago, the average soybean yields in Louisiana actually exceed those of the United States from 2010 to 2013. Historically, we have had a yield that was much lower than the U.S. average. In the 1980s, we were about 7 bushels an acre below the U.S. average. That increased to almost 10 bushels during the 1990s. Went back down to about 7 bushels, 6 to 7 bushels in the 2000s. But again, as the latter half of the 2000s and the 2010 to 2013, we've seen pretty substantial increases in terms of soybean yields here in Louisiana, more efficient production, and more profitable production of soybeans here in Louisiana during that time frame. Now we haven't seen quite the, and we still do have quite a bit of variability in terms of our soybean production and soybean yields. This is a map of Louisiana broken down by the 9 regions as identified by the National Agricultural Statistics Service. And when we look here, again, the central region, region 5, and the northeast region, region 3, are where a majority of our soybeans are grown. And if you look at the average yields there, that kind of gives you a glimpse of why they're grown there. Producers have been historically much more successful in producing soybeans in that area. When you look at the region 3, the northeast region, over the last 5 years, average soybean yields have been about 44 bushels an acre. That have been to the mid to upper 30 bushel per acre region. And then if you look at kind of our last area where we've starting to see now soybean expansion in terms of acreage in the southwest and the south central regions 7 and 8, those are the areas that we've had historically some of our lower yields because of insect, disease, weather pressure that we have in those areas. And again, when you look at those areas averaging in the low to mid 30 bushel an acre range versus the central and the northeast regions, which are averaging in the upper 30 to lower 40 bushel an acre range, you can see why production has kind of migrated to the central and the northeast region.